I'm not sure if you've noticed, but I play a lot of Fire Emblem on this channel. Fire Emblem's an awesome series and by far my favorite SRPG. But there's only 17 of them, and what am I supposed to do now that I've played all of them twice? Do you expect me to play Sacred Stones for the 800th time? Fortunately, there's a bunch of other SRPGs out there, and if you like Fire Emblem like I do, I bet you'll like some of them. I've played a lot of SRPGs, but still not as many as I'd like, so I brought on my friend Amy, who has played more SRPGs than anyone I know, to talk about what non-Fire Emblem RPGs are worth your time. So here's our conversation here. It's a little bit of a different content than I usually do. It's less scripted, kind of a little more conversational and podcasty. So at the end, let me know what you think of it. Hopefully you like it. Hi, Amy. Thanks for coming on to talk with me. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with Fire Emblem and other tactics RPGs?
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about one of my longtime favorite things, which is tactics/strategy RPGs. I've been playing strategy RPGs since I was in elementary school. The first game I played was Shining Force 2 for the Sega Genesis. As soon as I played that, I was like, oh my gosh, I love tactics games, so I had to kind of devour more and more. The first one I really fell in love with was Final Fantasy Tactics, which they kind of... I think it's the highest selling one until Three Houses, if I recall correctly. The first Fire Emblem I ever played was Blazing Blade, which is about a year or so after it came out for the Game Boy Advance. I really liked the colorful presentation of the characters and the simple but yet complex strategies that Fire Emblem offered. I thought that it was a really interesting little series and played... So I ended up I've played every game in the series except for Fire Emblem 2 and Fire Emblem 3 for the original games. I like generally to play on hard-ish difficulties, sometimes maddening mode, sometimes hard mode. Actually, Conquest Hard is the one I've never done Lunatic and Conquest, but I have done Awakening Lunatic, Houses, Maddening, and Engage, I think is also called Maddening, but I don't really remember. I don't like grinding, so I just stop at whatever difficulty I feel comfortable not having to grind in. My favorite games in the series are Three Houses, Radiant Dawn, Fate's Conquest, and Sacred Stones. I like pretty much all the games in the series to some extent, though, so I'm still waiting for the perfect game that combine all of the things I like most about the series with fantastic support, fantastic gameplay, cohesive world building and plot. So I'll pray that sooner or later that will happen. So when Lizard sent me a message about what strategy RPGs are like Fire Emblem, it's like I kind of feel like Fire Emblem's a pretty diverse series, so I tried to come up with a diverse list of games based on kind of the different expectations of what Fire Emblem is.
Yeah. It's funny that you started with Fire Emblem 7. I started at the same time, and then I think I stuck mostly with Fire Emblem and really only started branching out into other SRPGs more recently. So I was glad that you agreed to come on, because I don't think I know anyone that's played as many SRPGs as you, which is awesome. One of these days I'm going to have to get you to play the original Gaiden, though. I'm a big Gaiden propagandist.
In FE2? Yeah.
But we're not here to talk about Gaiden today, right? Talking about non-Fire Emblem.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later.
So yeah, what's the first game you wanted to talk about?
So one thing I thought would be interesting to talk about is so the first game I came up with was something which is definitely closer to a FE clone, I wanted to come up with kind of a diverse set. So the first game is called Banner of the Maid. It's basically a Chinese game. It's from China. It has definitely some design sensibilities compared to Conquest. It came out in 2019, a few months before Three Houses came out. It has a lot of the gameplay level design sensibilities of Conquest. You have your skill system that kind of that you can change the skills around over time, and you accumulate new skills. I think the maps feel kind of Conquest-ish in the sense that it's like the enemies won't you can't just bait one out at a time. You have to kind of prepare for entire groups coming at you, which I felt like is a very Conquest thing as well. You have to kind of have some more long-term thinking of what you're going to do in the subsequent turns. I like the map design. Some of the characters have branching commotions. It actually does have a weapon square, which is interesting. It features varying objectives and varying map styles, which I think is one really cool thing that I really liked about Conquest as well. The interesting thing about Banner of the Maid is that most of your playable characters are like 15-year-old girls for some reason. And a lot of the male playable units are really bad, which I thought was like really weird. It's like, so my party ended up being 12 cute girls and 2 random dudes, and the plot is the translation is not very good. I think it's really remarkable. I played a lot of 90s RPGs and strategy RPGs, and so those often had pretty mediocre translations as well. This is definitely in that zone of kind of like, is this the 1990s again? It has voice acting, but only in Chinese. It's an interesting game. It's fun, but not like, I wouldn't call it an all-time great or anything, but it's sort of, if you really want to scratch that Conquest itch, I feel like it's worth checking out. It's cheap. It's $17 on Steam, Switch. I think it's on PS4 as well.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is, I think, the closest to Fire Emblem on our list here. This is one that I would definitely recommend, like, if you've played all the Fire Emblem games and you're like, I don't really want different tactics RPG, I just want Fire Emblem, but to be Napoleon's sister and working in the service of, like, fan service Marie Antoinette. It's a super funny game in that way.
Interesting. I think it's a very unusual game in kind of its presentation. Like, I really wish it was translated better, because I feel like a lot of the plot I don't really even understand because of
this is one of the few games, even on the Fire Emblem stories I don't like, I still like read them. This one, I just started skipping it because I was like, I don't know what's going on. The translation's not great.
Pretty poor. And I was also going to mention it's about 20 hours long, which kind of puts in that spot of like, okay, well, this, you can pick it up and it won't take you too long to complete.
Yeah. I did think it had 2 interesting gameplay things that are a little different than Fire Emblem. One was that Fire Emblem has always either had breakable weapons or unbreakable weapons. And this game's like kind of in the middle because the weapons have uses. Like you'll get like a gun or whatever with 12 uses, but it's like 12 uses for that map. Yeah,
and then they recharge in the next map, and so you get like different weapons that can like some of the weapons being, longer range or more powerful or faster. And there is, there's doubling and stuff as well, just like in Fire Emblem. So that's why the game feels pretty Fire Emblem-ish. But I will, this is just a warning. It's a gameplay game. Don't play it for the plot.
Oh, it does have cool super attacks, though. That's different from Fire Emblem. You can like charge up super attacks and they have a cool animation, and I like them.
Yeah. I like them as well.
All right, so that's Banner of the Maid. Definitely a cool game if you're into like the traditional Fire Emblem gameplay. And I have another one that is good if you're into the traditional Fire Emblem gameplay. Grey Heritage is an indie game made by B-Train Studios, and it's made using SRPG Studio. And you're going to notice that as soon as you play the game. Like, it has all of the SRPG Studio things, the UI elements that you're going to be familiar with if you've played other games in this engine. But I love this game because it feels like such a love letter to Fire Emblem 4 and 5, but with some modernizations that get rid of some of the things that are annoying in those games. It has big maps like FE4 does. They're not quite FE4 big, but they're big. They're bigger than your usual Fire Emblem map. But it's not annoying because they put these save tiles in. So a whole map might take an hour, but it'll have like 3 or 4 save points. So if you only have 20 minutes to play, it's great.
Yeah, because like I was thinking, like one of the things I actually really like about FE4 is maps are freaking huge, but you can save every turn, which means that you can kind of pace the game in whatever fashion you want. So I'm really glad That's actually what I was thinking when I was reading your notes on it. It's like, oh, I wonder if it has save points.
Yeah. It has the save points, which gives it that kind of FE4 vibe where it's a big map, but you don't have to play the whole thing in one sitting.
Yeah.
Maps have a lot of indoor portions where people need to dismount, which kind of, if you've played FE4 with the big maps, you remember kind of horses dominate because they just go so far away from everybody else. But there's a lot of indoor portions here, so everybody gets a chance to shine.
I like Thracia, yeah.
Yeah, exactly like Thracia.
Yeah.
And one cool thing they did with archers, archers can mount like many other units can, but instead of mounting a horse, they mount a ballista. And ballistas in this game are so much better than what I'm used to in Fire Emblem. They can double, they do a lot of damage, it's crazy. But they only have like 30 uses, so you got to be a little careful with them until you can buy or steal more of them.
Mm-hmm. And so does, and do they still have the like 10 range?
Oh yeah, I don't know if it's exactly 10, but it's big. It's big range.
Yeah.
It in many ways to me feels like a kinder Thracia. It has a lot of the things I love from Thracia. You can like steal weapons from enemies. There are hidden goodies that you can find, but that aren't essential to beating the game. But it's a little nicer. There's less tricks. There's no permadeath, which is not always my favorite. Usually I like permadeath, but it's a pretty small cast. You have like 10 to 15 units, so permadeath really wouldn't work for this game, I don't think. Yeah. But one thing that they did that I like, there is no permadeath, but the game over condition for most maps is like if 3 units die.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
You can't just kill off all of your units.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Yeah, Banner of the Maid has some stuff similar to that as well. So I think it's interesting that both games kind of diverge from permadeath, but kind of still... Because I think there's a balance there, right? Because you don't want it to just be totally... There's no consequence for... I mean, obviously some people play on casual. I'm not trying to disparage that, but like as a kind of hardcore strategy RPG gamer, I want consequences for my characters not surviving, but at the same time, permadeath can be pretty harsh. So I think both of those things are both having kind of semi-permadeath where you game over in certain circumstances, I think is a good thing.
Yeah. Another cool thing about this game is I think the developer was really bold with some of the map design. There's a prison break map where the gameplay revolves around you freeing these green units from prison cells, and they do like all of the fighting for you because you have a thief, a Pegasus Knight without a lance at the beginning of the map, and you just have to free these green units to go fight the prisoners for you. And I was like, this is such a cool map.
Nice.
And there's like another one where your units are split up, but you have to tackle 3 different objectives, and it almost feels like you're playing 3 chapters at the same time in a way that I found really enjoyable.
That's fun, yeah.
The story is okay. It's not bad, but it also doesn't get in the way. You get pretty brief cutscenes in between maps. There's no supports, but sometimes between chapters, 2 characters will have a conversation with each other, which is essentially a support. There's just not like a support menu where you go click them.
Yeah. And Kelly's system is kind of neat. Like, it's sort of like... I think one of the nice things is... Or I think one of the disadvantages of the support system is that because if you don't... You could get them at a variety of different times. It's hard to time them with the story. So one of the things I did like in the Telia system is that you actually... those scenes can be timed with the story, so they can actually discuss things that happen within the plot. So I think that's a cool addition.
That's a good point I hadn't thought of, because like there are conversations in this game that happen when it makes sense to in the story, right? Like two characters have a conversation about them meeting each other, and it's when one of them joins the army, and I'm like, yeah, that it makes sense to have this conversation now. It wouldn't make sense to have this conversation 10 chapters from now.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is a nice benefit I hadn't thought of.
And so how do you play this game?
Oh, so it is a PC game. I think it's only on PC. You can get it on Steam. I like playing it with, it's an SRPG game, so it has like controller and keyboard support. I found the best way to control it was just with the mouse. The keyboard controls I didn't like so much.
Right, okay.
but clicking around was fine. It's a really nice length. Beating it takes like 10 to 15 hours.
Nice.
So it doesn't overstay its welcome. I thought all the maps they did were cool. So especially if you like FE4 or FE5, especially because Fire Emblem's kind of moved away from those design sensibilities, I think. So if you like those games, this is a really cool, a little more modern take on that type of design.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a good niche to fill for sure.
Yeah.
So I was gonna anyways, I may look into buying this game, but anyways. So the next set of games I was going to talk about is sort of a little bit different. So these are almost your not particularly Fire Emblem-ish. Like the first two games we talked about are kind of, I would obviously not clones, but kind of very similar. The games I'm going to talk about are not really similar, I would say. So the three games I was going to discuss are job system games. The reason I grouped them together is because they're all almost like they kind of go in a line, progressively changing relative to each other, even though they're not even in the same series, but they're clearly kind of in the same series. So Tactics Ogre Reborn came out in 2020, I think 22 for the Switch, but it was originally released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo. And then the Tactics Ogre team transferred over to Squaresoft before it became Square Enix, and they made Final Fantasy Tactics. So Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics were made by the same team. At some point, which I don't really remember exactly when, the Square Enix took over whatever company owned Tactics Ogre, and then re-released Tactics Ogre as Tactics Ogre. Well, first the PSP version, and then Reborn. So these two games kind of felt like they collectively influenced the genre for years to come. So they're almost like an alternate branch from FE. They have jobs. It's like a job system games primarily. They're grid based, just like FE, but I feel like so the other thing that makes them kind of similar, I think most strategy RPGs follow this style, is kind of like, okay, we're gonna have a battle, then we're gonna have some plot, and then another battle, and then some more plot, and then another battle, and then some more plot, kind of very much like this formulaic system of kind of storytelling with plot and gameplay interspersed with each other. Phil Steele, the third game I mentioned, is a Kickstarter game that was released in 2019. It takes a lot of design concepts from FFT and kind of balances them out. Like, FFT was a pretty ambitious game in terms of it's like, okay, we're gonna have a big job system with like 20 jobs and like hundreds of skills, but some of the skills are overpowered, some of them are horrible. And so Phil Steele kind of takes that kind of FFT idea and try to make it into more of like a,
So is a lot of the jobs DNA? So in addition to being a big Fire Emblem fan, I'm also a big Final Fantasy fan.
Yeah.
Are a lot of the jobs and skills kind of from that DNA, or did they reinvent a lot of things here?
Tactics is very similar to Final Fantasy V. So Final Fantasy V is the sorry, I'm also a big Final Fantasy nerd. So Final Fantasy III Original, which was not released in North America until actually 2023, it had kind of like a really rudimentary job system where you could change jobs, and then Final Fantasy V kind of iterated on that, and then Final Fantasy Tactics definitely took its job system from Final Fantasy V. So it has Black Mage and White Mage and Knight and Thief and all those kind of classic Final Fantasy jobs, which I think, of course, Final Fantasy XIV, the MMO, also has a bunch of the kind of same type of jobs, I think. So yeah, Final Fantasy Tactics definitely has that FF5 DNA. Tactics Ogre, I feel like the job system, again, is a little more rudimentary. Like, it's kind of, there are jobs, but they're sort of not nearly as, there's not much of a skill system in that game. I think Final Fantasy Tactics almost feels like kind of like the sequel where they decided to be a little more ambitious with the skill system. But Phil Steele does not have the same type of Final Fantasy jobs. It's a lot of them feel a little reskinned in the sense you've got Scoundrel instead of Thief, and
sure.
I don't remember it's like Minder instead of White Mage or whatever, but kind of the same ideas. But yeah, it does definitely have the Final Fantasy DNA in that sense. And so I was gonna say, so these games, they have job systems, kind of like houses, but a lot more elaborate, and especially Failsail and FFT. There's no uniform countering, which I think is like kind of something I think of as very quintessentially Fire Emblem. The games have a variety of reactions, which can do a variety of things. Like, for example, so my spouse is currently playing Failsail, and there's a skill that it's like, okay, you have X number of magic points. Okay, well, if you have a skill equipped, the enemy hits you, they absorb your magic points. Like, your magic points take damage for you, and so, or there's a skill that it's like, okay, if you get hit, you put up a barrier where you no longer can be hit by status. Or if you go down to critical HP, you immediately get a turn, or things like that. So it's like a reaction slot, so you can put different things in that slot.
Mm-hmm.
And so it adds like a little bit, like you can put just counters if you want. Like there are still just a counter ability, but there's also lots of other things that you can put in that slot instead. So, which I think is kind of neat. And I feel like the storytelling style is a little different. I feel like Fire Emblem is a little bit more I don't even mean this in a disparaging way, but kind of anime style, kind of there's heated passions and, really, dramatic cutscenes and kind of,
Yeah, Fire Emblem's definitely not beating the anime allegations.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, that's not even an insult, it's just the truth. Whereas I felt like all three of these games are a little bit more of the grounded serious war stories. I feel like they're not as character-driven as Fire Emblem because of the lack of support system. I actually feel like all three games do suffer a bit from you don't get to know your characters nearly as well as Fire Emblem, which I think is one of the strengths of the series. There are scattered good characters, but it's almost like in the, Shakespearean style of like, there happens to be a good character rather than you getting to know them intimately through the support system. FFT and Failsail, they're more customizable. Tactics Ogre has branching routes, which obviously some of the Fire Emblems do. FFT probably has the best story. Some of it's like I like its gameplay. Like I have to admit that I'm pretty biased because it's the first game I really fell in love with, so I have a lot of nostalgia for it. They did sometimes some of the stuff. It just feels like they threw stuff at the wall. It's like, why did you think that was balanced? That's so not balanced. Like, wow. You did not think that went through. There's one ability that's called like CT5 Holy. So basically you use the Holy spell on every enemy whose turn count is divisible by 5. And so what that actually is in practice is you hit basically everyone with Holy, but then you can give your characters Holy absorbing. So you heal all of your characters and you kill all the enemies. And so, of course, I will admit that takes a lot of twinking and kind of like advanced knowledge of the game, but it's just like unbeatable if you actually set it up. So it's like, so some of the stuff we just kind of went a little over the top in terms of its, okay, this is so broken, but it was fun, but kind of like it probably needed to be reined in a bit, which is what Failsail does.
It sounds like there's a lot of emphasis on builds in this game, like skills and jobs and stuff, which reminds me a lot of like Awakening and Conquest. Well, and I guess Fates as a whole. Just Conquest is the one that I play the most.
Yeah. I've played a lot. I played Conquest, I think 6 times now.
Do you think that this is the type of game that people that like those games would enjoy for like that unit building aspect?
I think the unit building aspect is definitely good, and Failsail, I think it reins in. Like, I guess I would in some ways say like Awakening. I don't think Awakening and FFT are that similar, but kind of both of them get a little out of control with the. I feel like Awakening is definitely. I remember what's it called, Gale Force, where you just like.
Yeah. Really
is a little silly, and FFT has some pretty silly stuff as well. So if you kind of like building really silly things, I think FFT kind of does that, whereas Failsail is kind of interesting. It has the thing that's really interesting about Failsail is it has incredibly customizable difficulty. So it has like an easy, normal, hard, very hard, but it also has like additional switches on the difficulty. Getting back to the thing that we were discussing with Grey Heritage, there's a penalty. The penalty for dying in Fell Seal is that you cannot use your character in the next battle, basically. So they're just like, it's almost like Theresia's, what's it called?
The stamina?
Stamina system, that's right. You can use the character in the next battle, but they have lower stats, and they will have lower stats until you sit them out for one battle. But you can turn that off if you hate it. If you're like, I cannot handle this is so annoying, you can just flick the option off if you want. So there's a lot of like, it's kind of an interesting, like they have like their recommended difficulty modes, which which are called easy, normal, hard, very hard, or whatever. And but you can also, if you want to play very hard but you hate the injury system, you can just flick it off. So I think it's kind of nice that you can like make your own difficulty of it. So
yeah, I think difficulty options like that like aren't just easy, normal, hard, where you can like kind of specifically tune things that you may or may not like, I think is cool.
I think it's a really neat idea. And I feel like Fell Seal, I will say, kind of like the plot is definitely not super great. It feels like, I don't know how to say this. It's almost like the person, because it was just a couple who made the game, a husband and wife I think they're from Quebec, actually. And I think it was very clear they had some passion for art. They had passion for gameplay. But the plot, I feel like, is just like, it sure is a plot. It gets you from place to place, but I don't really think it's very inspiring.
Yeah, I think that's a trend with a lot of like games with smaller teams. I mean, it has to be tough, right? Like, if you're making a game with a small team, it's like, great, I have all of these ideas for a game.
Yeah.
But am I a writer, you know?
Yeah, totally. And I think you notice that a lot with indie devs. They're kind of like, I love making games and putting these cool gameplay systems together and plot. The last thing I was going to mention is Tactics Ogre is definitely the least customizable of these games. It feels, it does have the route splitting. It, honestly, like, it's my least favorite of these three just because it feels the most simple, but some people really like its plot. I'm not really an enormous fan of its plot. It obviously appeals to some people. I think it, for people who really like darker stories, it appeals to, but not a huge fan. Reborn kind of takes out some of the more annoying stuff in the gameplay compared to the old Super Nintendo game, but I did find it a little on the easy side compared to the old games as well.
Would you say, if someone's playing it for the first time, would you say go with the original or Reborn?
Do Reborn. Well, the original is pretty hard to find, but I mean, Reborn you can just buy on the Switch. I think Reborn is probably the definitive version. There's probably I've seen some arguments that the other versions are better, but I overall felt like the Reborn is the most accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I was going to mention, the last thing I was going to say, these games are all in the 25 to 35 hour range in terms of length, a little longer than the other two games we discussed, but not super duper duper long.
That's a good length for an RPG.
Sure. Fell Seal, I will say, I'm pretty sure, again, is pretty inexpensive on Steam or Switch. FFT is surprisingly difficult to find. It's not on Steam, which almost all the Final Fantasies are. It's not on, like, I just played, what's it called? PR. What's PR stand for? Pixel Remaster for Final Fantasy 3. And
ooh, I love that one.
yeah, and so I'm really hoping that they release Final Fantasy Tactics at some point. So right now, the only places I know it's available is PS1 and mobile. So
it's actually kind of crazy that they haven't re-released Final Fantasy Tactics yet. I feel like it would print money.
I know. I don't understand what they're doing. I think, and I kind of remember I think it was the highest selling strategy RPG until Three Houses.
That's pretty impressive, because that's a long time to hold that
It is a
record.
long time. Yeah.
Um,
Anyways, yeah, awesome. Sorry for rambling a little bit,
no,
but
not at all. But another game with builds. My next game is Disgaea, and specifically, I really like Disgaea 4 and Disgaea 5. There is one more after 5. Disgaea 6 is the most recent one, but I don't recommend that one too much for reasons I'll get into a little later.
I'm very interested to hear this.
But Disgaea is all about building ridiculously strong units that can deal ridiculous amounts of damage. Like, the caps in Disgaea are all like 9,999 for like level, damage, everything. So you can get everything really high. So if you like grinding, this game has a lot of that. It also has a ton of like wacky mechanics that I really enjoy. It's a normal grid-based combat system, but your units can stack on top of each other, but not like Fire Emblem where you like do a rescue or a pair up. I mean, like literally the unit on the bottom carries the unit on top of them on their shoulders, and you can keep stacking units like that. And then you can either like whack an enemy with the entire tower or start like chucking your units around the map. And I think that's so funny.
Certainly a way of mobility.
I actually think like some Fire Emblem players, I think will really enjoy that, because I know some people, myself included, really enjoy like movement optimization in Fire Emblem, where it's like, ooh, how can I get my unit from point A to point B quickest, like with a rescue drop and a warp or whatever. And in this game, it's like, okay, let's just chuck our units around. The army that you use in Disgaea is always a mix of named characters who are like your main characters relevant to the story, and generic units that you can summon. And my favorite part of Disgaea is it's not the gameplay, it's the units that you can give generics. Because when you make a unit, the game will generate a name that you can use, and you can just keep pressing the randomize button to get new ones. And many of them are normal names, but also some of them are crazy. Like you can roll fish sausage or national holiday or buy one get one free as names for a unit, which makes me laugh every time.
It's so funny.
The units are also incredibly customizable. You pick a class for them, and then you pick what weapons and items to give them, as well as what abilities. And then it's kind of time to grind, because you can level up all of those things, literally everything. So you can level up your characters, you can level up your weapons, your abilities. You can even level up consumables. So it's like in Fire Emblem, if you could level up your vulneraries up to like level 999, it's crazy. So if you like making super broken builds, because that's kind of the goal here. It's like we grind up our units so they're all dealing ridiculous amounts of damage and, barely taking any damage in return. It's all about making these broken builds.
Nice.
The story in these games tends to be very silly, and how much you like that will depend on how the humor lands. Disgaea 4 has my favorite story because I think the plot is really funny. You play as a vampire named Valvatores, who hasn't drank blood in the last 400 years because he promised someone that he wouldn't drink blood again until he scared them, and then they died before he scared them. So he can't drink blood anymore.
That's peak Disgaea.
And then like the main plot is that you're leading a rebellion to prevent the mass execution of Prinnies, who are these goofy little bat penguins that explode if you throw them. And it's a plot that really doesn't take itself very seriously, which is why I like it a little better than 5. 5's plot is okay, but it has like these serious melodramatic moments, which is just not what I play this series for.
I think that's interesting. So have you played 4 and 5 and 6? Well, you said you were going to talk about 6.
Yeah, I've played 3, 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I played Disgaea 1, and it's kind of in that same category of it's so silly. And then I remember hearing about Disgaea 2, and they were saying, oh, well, the plot is much more serious. And I was like, what?
Yeah, I've heard that too about 2. I don't want to overstate how serious 5 is. It's definitely still silly. Like, they make jokes and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's like, in between these really dramatic scenes, like much more dramatic than Disgaea 4, and I was like, this is
A
a weird
little,
tonal
almost
shift.
like, what's the word? Kind of like the tonal shift between the super silly scenes and the super serious scenes.
Yeah, exactly.
Not really work. Yeah. I definitely agree.
The reason I don't like 6, we can get into that now. 6 is when they shifted from the 2D sprites to the 3D models. Which one was a change I didn't like. I liked the 2D models. But 2, it means the game really has performance issues on the Switch. Like, that's not something that usually bothers me, but it's really noticeable in this game.
Interesting.
And also, they added an auto battle feature, which I thought sounded cool at first. It's like you kind of program your units. So you're like, okay, if there's an enemy near you, do this. If there's not, move to the closest enemy. And it's like a fairly robust programming system. But the reason I don't like it is because the reward for like doing the programming system well is that you just don't play the game anymore. Like, you send your units to the map and they just win the map for you, and you do this until you're tired of playing, I guess. And it just wasn't for me. I was like, I wanna actually play the game.
Yeah. No, that's how. So you would recommend 4 among the Disgaea games then?
4 or 5. I think 4 has a better plot than 5. 5 has better mechanics than 4. Like, if you want all of the crazy builds and all of the crazy mechanics, I would play 5. If you're like, I want some of the crazy I want plenty of crazy mechanics and also a better plot, then I would go with 4.
Right, cool. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I haven't played since 1, but, it's always a series that I've considered playing. Apparently, I just remembered that apparently there's Disgaea 7 is coming out in October.
Yes, these games come out faster than I expect every time.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, these games, I think they're not too expensive. I don't know what exactly the price is, but I don't think they're very pricey. You can get them on Switch. I don't know, 6 was a Switch exclusive for a while. I don't know if it still is. But 4 and 5 you can get on PC, PlayStation, Switch. I don't think Xbox. I think just those 3. But pretty widely available.
Nice. Yeah, I might pick it up on the Switch then.
Yeah, it's a fun one. I recommend it. I think you'll like it.
Sweet. Awesome. And so the last one I was going to talk about, well, I guess not last, but one of the next ones I'm going to talk about is Triangle Strategy. So Triangle Strategy came out in 2022. It actually has an interesting mix. It reminds me a little bit of Three Houses and a little bit of kind of like that Final Fantasy Tactics, Ogre. Mixed a little bit in a blender. It has a lot of morally complex characters, and you're never really sure what to think about a variety of the characters. It also has branching routes. So the interesting thing with Triangle Strategy is that the first branching routes don't really matter very much. Like, you'll get like alternate PCs or whatever, but the story kind of reintegrates a couple of times. And then towards the end of the game, there's a final route split, which determines which path you go on for the rest of the game. So that would be about 3/4 into the game, you get like a permanent route split. So it's a little bit different than like Fates and Three Houses, where you have to make that choice relatively early. I kind of like that I think it's kind of interesting that they build a really kind of robust story first, and then you can make your route decision a little bit more naturally rather than having to just guess. Well,
yeah,
I like that guy because he's blue.
I like that too, because when I was playing Fates, that was definitely, I made my decision exclusively based on which royals I liked the designs of more.
It's like, and I kind of feel like, okay, well, it's nice in this game because it's like, okay, well, I can actually make an informed decision about what I'm choosing, so it's kind of nice. And so the other thing that kind of brought to mind Three Houses about this game was that there's 3 primary, I guess you would call them, they're very similar to the Three Houses 3 lores in the sense that they all have pretty strong personalities and they all have really strong opinions about what's going on in the story. you have like a main character. He's not silent like Byleth, but he is, I guess, malleable in terms of his personality. A little bit kind of a push. I wouldn't say a pushover, but it's like he definitely doesn't have as strong a personality as the three sort of driving forces in the story. Like one of the guys who's a driving force is like the main character's like butler or sort of retainer. One of them is his fiance, and one of them is his best friend. And they have very different ideas about how everything in the world should go. I think the story is definitely more coherent and less messy than Three Houses. I think Three Houses definitely, as much as I really like it, kind of suffers a little bit from its ambitious in its storytelling, but sometimes it's a little bit more ideas than execution, whereas I think Triangle Strategy is a little bit more reined in, but kind of executes most of its story beats pretty well.
Yeah. I thought they picked a really good scope for Triangle Strategy. It feels big, but it doesn't feel too big. Like they have the time to fully explore, I think, all of the things that they want to explore.
Yeah, and I definitely think that it feels pretty contained. Like, I think Houses definitely goes a little out of control with the kind of like, there's so many spider webs of things going on, and you have to keep track of all of it. And I've actually been watching a friend play Three Houses recently, and he comes over once a week and plays, and he has a lot of trouble keeping track of all the things that are going on. So I think Triangle Strategy feels a little bit more manageable in that sense. I think probably the big disadvantage, I would say, I think aside from those three really prominent characters, I think a lot of the supporting cast is not that strong. I think because it doesn't really have much of a support system at all. It has a couple of scenes, but I honestly felt I don't even really remember those scenes. So I think the secondary characters definitely get left behind compared to, again, the support system of Fire Emblem, which I think I really like. I really, really like both Benedict and Frederica, who are two of the characters from the game. I think they're both really compelling, complex. They have their own ideas. They push along the plot. They don't agree on very many things. I actually really enjoy when characters argue and there's a lot of conflict in stories, and so Frederica and Benedict really did it for me. Gameplay's fun. I don't think it's as good at gameplay as Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics. I think it's a little bit, I don't know, like, the AI seems a little bit odd in the game. I think sometimes the units, the enemy units, do things that are kind of weird and unexpected and not even like an interesting way, but it's kind of like, why did that enemy walk all the way over there for no reason? So sometimes I think Triangle Strategy definitely need a little bit more time to kind of polish the gameplay a bit. I played hard mode, and hard mode's really hard. I definitely wouldn't recommend it on a first playthrough unless you're really confident in your abilities. Its individual battles are fun. The outside of battle system is almost the opposite of Disgaea. It is not very exciting or enjoyable. I think the customization outside of battle is quite weak compared to all, like, certainly Disgaea and pretty much all the Fire Emblems with any customization. The documentation is surprisingly poor. I had a lot of trouble figuring out what abilities did. I went on Reddit to try to find out, and most people on Reddit there didn't really seem to be even information on the internet about, okay, so this ability boosts my attack by 2, but what does that mean? So nobody seems to really know what that means.
That was something I struggled with, because I agree that I have more fun with the gameplay of Fire Emblem than I do Triangle Strategy. Yeah. But I honestly wonder how much of that is just because there are times in Triangle Strategy where I'm like, I don't know what this does.
Yeah, I don't understand.
I've been playing Fire Emblem for so long that I just know what the things do, you know?
Like, I just don't think they don't tell you what they do. It's like, and then like you have the skill system, but the skill system is increase attack by 2, increase defense by 2, increase magic defense by 2, and you're like, I don't know what effects any of those things actually have. I had so much trouble. I still haven't really figured out how much does that affect how much damage I take. Like, I don't know the answer to that question. I think if you are trying to make informed decisions about which skill to choose, it's really useful. So I always just choose abilities first, because it's like, okay, if it's an ability, then I can read the description of what the ability does. But like the stats is just like totally opaque.
Yeah.
So I like the game, and I think the plot's really fun and interesting, and I love Benedict. And but I do think it does have some gameplay, sort of, especially the out of battle stuff. I think is pretty much the opposite of Disgaea, and not particularly satisfying at all. Anyways, and this isn't to end it on a negative note. I think the story is very fun, very cool, very ambitious. Hardly any characters you go away with going, this person's 100% good or this person's 100% evil. Almost everyone is sort of in that middle range, and I think that's something that's pretty cool about it.
Yeah. I also really loved Benedict. I liked a few characters in this game, but Benedict was a standout for me.
He's so good.
He's so like calculating. Like, one of the most memorable moments in the game for me is there's a chapter where you're repelling an attack on your town.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh man, how are we going to do this? The enemies are so much stronger than us. And Benedict is like, what if we set the town on fire? And you can. It's like an option in the map. So I thought that was really cool, because it was one of those moments where like the story integrated with the gameplay really well, where when I played the game on normal, I was like, I'm going to win the map without setting the town on fire. Because I don't want to set the town on fire. Then I played it on hard, and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to set the town on fire.
Actually, I had exactly the same experience. I actually just played Triangle Strategy hard a couple months ago, and I was trying so hard to beat that map on without setting the town on fire, and I was like, I can't do this. I've got to set it on fire. So I felt really guilty, but yeah, I totally agree. And some of the stuff that Benedict proposes, you're just like, whew, that's definitely a war crime, buddy.
Well, and it's funny because sometimes it's like the fire one where you're like, okay, we're outnumbered. Maybe we do need to do this. But I feel like sometimes Benedict really just jumps to the war crime.
You're... I made a joke. So like I run fanzines in my part of the rest of my time, and I made a joke. It's like, oh well, I'm gonna make a fanzine about Benedict called "War Crimes Are Okay as Long as It's for House Wolford." And so I think Benedict is very into the full do whatever it takes to win. And so,
but like in a good way, right? Like he's such a cool character.
He's a really cool character, and kind of like some of the stuff. Like, and then so the last. Have you completed the game?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. I didn't want to like.
No,
I don't want to spoil it. I'm not going to spoil it. Never mind. I was just going to say some of the stuff he says in a couple of the routes in the route split, kind of very fascinating as well. So I definitely recommend it for plot. The gameplay is okay. Like, I'm not trying to say, oh my god, the gameplay is awful. It's just not what I would recommend it for necessarily. So.
Yeah, it has a couple interesting things in the gameplay. I like the class that's based around like setting up ladders and things, which sounds like it should be useless, but is actually pretty cool.
One thing I like about it is I find so often that the big defensive, especially male characters, are often not very good. And Eridor is actually quite a good PC. He has the like multi-target like berserk, which I thought is like which I use quite a bit on, especially like you can use it on healers and stuff, and the healers will just hit your tank. And so I really like that they gave Eridor the ability to tank by making enemies berserk. And so because like I feel like with armor knights in Fire Emblem, I'm not saying they're all bad, but like a lot of them, it's like
it's okay. Most of them are bad.
Because Oswin is okay.
Yeah, there's a few standouts, but not too many.
I felt like it's like I remember trying to use Arden in FE4 and going.
Oh, Arden is so depressing. Even the manga makes fun of him. his first appearance in the manga is like at Sigurd's wedding. He's in one panel and he's like, "Oh, I'm so glad you remembered to tell me to come over from the castle." And then he's not in it anymore after that. It's so sad.
That's pretty sad. But anyways, yeah. But anyways, I kind of thought, it's kind of neat that Eridor, he still has a massive, his magic defense is still absolutely horrible, and that's certainly not great, but at least he's like these. Anyways, I was going to say, again, triangle strategies in that 25 to 30 hour range. Pretty nice kind of strategy RPG length, in my opinion. It's on Switch and Steam.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, that's going to bring us to my last game, which is Shadowrun Returns, which is based on the fantasy cyberpunk tabletop RPG of the same name. So the setting is a dystopian future where countries are basically completely controlled by a few megacorporations. And where the fantasy comes in is you have like orcs and elves, and like some of the megacorporations are run by dragons.
Nice.
It's neat. I like the setting a lot. And we take the role of a Shadowrunner, who's someone that operates outside of the law, performing jobs for money. And in this case, we're investigating the death of an old friend of ours. And the game's really heavy on the role-playing aspect of the SRPG. You get to build a character, kind of like an avatar in the more recent Fire Emblem games, but beyond choosing what they do in combat, you also get to pick their background and knowledge, which impacts dialogue options throughout the entire game, which I really liked. Like, I made my character what did I make him the first time? I think I made him gave him a background in academia, which made it easier to like get into an academic space you needed to get into later in the game. And I thought that was neat.
That's cool. Yeah. Kind of the customizable, kind of closer to like the WRPG style of like, Western RPG style of like, oh, you can customize your characters and they have different aspects based on.
Yeah, it's a lot like that. It's where you really feel like that, like, right, this is based on a tabletop RPG.
Yeah.
And when it does come time to do combat, Fire Emblem fans will feel pretty much right at home with the grid-based approach. There's a few differences. There's, like, cover, for one thing, so you can, like, stand behind something and it will add to your defense. I guess that's not that different than standing on a fort in Fire Emblem. Besides that, like, the positioning matters. So, like, if an enemy runs by the object that you're taking cover from behind, well, now you don't have cover anymore.
Have you played XCOM? Is it similar to that?
Yes, very similar to XCOM.
Yeah.
Or at least the basics of it are similar to XCOM. There's more randomness than you have in Fire Emblem. In Fire Emblem, I feel like you have random hits and you have random crits and maybe you have some proc skills, right? But for the most part, you kind of know what an attack is going to do when you press the attack button, right? Like, you know exactly how much damage it's going to do if it hits. Not the case in Shadowrun. There's ranges of damage, so you don't know exactly how much you're going to do, and there are also glancing blows, which are kind of an in-between of hit and miss. So it's like you can miss and do no damage, hit and do lots of damage, or do a glancing blow and do like a little bit of damage. Another thing that was kind of interesting is the way that they break up the actions. In something like Fire Emblem, it's like you move, and then you can attack or use an item, right? Mm-hmm. In Shadowrun, it's you have, I believe the amount of action points you have varies depending on your character, and different actions take up different amount of points. So if you want to move really far, you could spend all of your action points on moving, or if you don't want to move at all, you could attack twice.
That makes sense. Yeah. That's neat.
So there's like an interesting kind of puzzly nature of combat where it's like, oh, how do I want to spend my action points?
What's the best, what's the most optimal way to spend my points? Yeah, that kind of stuff. That sounds good.
Yeah. The combat and the maps don't feel as designed as Fire Emblem maps, and this is where it also kind of feels a bit more like a Western RPG, where in Fire Emblem you have every combat is preset, right? It's like we have these maps, the combats are going to happen on these maps. And there are set piece moments in Shadowrun that are like that, but there are also times where you'll like talk to an NPC and pick a fight with them or whatever, and you'll just have a street fight with them right there in the middle of the street or whatever.
Right. And would those be pretty short combats?
Yeah, they'll be very quick. Most combat in this game is a lot faster than Fire Emblem. Like, it's smaller scale too. You don't usually have more than a few allies at any given time, and you're not usually fighting more than 5 or 6 enemies at any given time, beyond like a couple big fights later in the game. Or if you played there's a build option you can do where you make these little robots, and then you have a lot of guys if you make a bunch of robots. So the combat in this one is fun. I like the combat, but the real draw is the setting, the storytelling, and the character building. It's a pretty good mystery story. I enjoyed it. I didn't figure out the solution before they revealed it, but it also didn't feel like they pulled it out of nowhere. I was like, oh, that makes sense. I could have figured that out.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah.
So it was a good mystery story. I think it's great for people that really like the RPG part of Fire Emblem, or if you really like the avatar units and you want to have your avatar be even more customizable, both in terms of narrative and gameplay. So I think that's like a neat aspect of this game.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. I was going to say, interestingly, I actually played a Shadowrun game for the Genesis. I'm pretty sure it was it wasn't a strategy RPG. I would remember if it was. But kind of very interesting setting, sort of kind of feels a little at home, yet not. Mentioning the mega corporations, which is actually kind of funny. When I played that game in around 2000, I guess I didn't realize the extent. It's like living in 2023 where mega corporations are really prominent. Yeah. Looking back on that, it feels very like they were kind of predicting the future a bit.
Yeah, this is definitely a game you'll enjoy if you're very cynical about corporations like I am.
It's me. Yeah, and I remember my brother. So I had a much older brother who actually was the person who introduced me to video games, and so I think he used to read like Shadowrun book series, and so I think he read like 20 or 30 of those books as well. And so I never played the tabletop game, but I did kind of have a familiarity with the setting, and it's pretty cool. So.
Yeah, so those were the main games we wanted to talk about, but there were a few more that we wanted to give a quicker, I guess, honorable mention of.
The first game I was going to mention was there's this game called Brigandine, The Legend of Runeseria. It's a sequel to an obscure PlayStation 1 game released 2 decades later. I remember being totally flabbergasted that it ever came out. Brigandine 1, I think, probably sold 35,000 copies or less. I did not ever believe that they would release a sequel, and then they released a sequel in 2021. A couple interesting things about Brigandine 2. It has a hex-based grid instead of the chess-type grid from pretty much every other game that's been discussed. It has a strategy map element layered on top of the tactical element. You can play as 6 different countries with 6 sets of playable characters. And then you have monsters, which are subjected to permadeath. So you have regular, you have one general, and then they have 4 monsters. The general can't die. They can retreat from a battle, but they can't die, whereas the 4 monsters can die in permadeath fashion. So it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid. The gameplay is compelling and ever-changing, kind of like what you mentioned with Shadowrun. There's no preset battles like Fire Emblem, but there's kind of changing conditions every time. Don't play this game for plot, LOL. It has some nice art. Its plot is very...
I just looked it up. This is very... I like the art a lot, actually.
Yeah, it's an interesting art style. The plot translation is pretty bad. It's a fun gameplay game. It's for the Switch, PS4, Steam. It's a neat game. I was so shocked that it came out. I was just like, what?
No.
How could you release a sequel to this?
How do you feel about, I know you mentioned this is a hex grid. How do you feel about that? Do you think that like changes a lot about the way the game plays?
I don't think it's that much. I think it feels very familiar. It's a little different just because, obviously you can surround enemies more. It also kind of has like a system where if two units are on opposite sides, you have higher accuracy, almost kind of like how in Awakening you can boost accuracy with pairing up. So I kind of like that. I think it's kind of nice to have options to that kind of reduce randomness. So. But I don't think the hex changes that much fundamentally.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And the second game I was going to talk about was Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. It's, again, another game I'm like, how does this even exist? It's I guess Ubisoft decided to call up Mario, or call up Nintendo, and was like, hey, can we use Mario for a strategy RPG based around Mario meeting up with the raving Rabbids from Rayman? And
I don't know how they pulled that off. Like,
just like
I'm shocked that Nintendo said yes, and then I'm really shocked that it's actually pretty good.
Yeah, and I'm like, what? It reminds me a little of Engage, in terms of like, I think the thing that reminds me most of Engage is kind of like it's a gameplay focused, lighthearted. The combat is quite complex. It gives you lots of tools to do a lot of things. You were talking about you really like the movement options. So there's so many movement options. You can jump on top of other characters. You can slide into enemies. You can do lots of different things in order to be successful in combat. You only control 3 characters, which is, of course, quite different than Fire Emblem. But there's a lot of moving parts to play with in the game. The theming's a bit different, obviously. It's a Mario plus Rabbids with guns. But if you really like kind of like complex gameplay where there's lots of moving parts to play around with, it's pretty cool. It's only on the Switch because even though it's third party, it has Mario in it. I think, I don't think they could realistically take it to any other console. It has a sequel which came out in October of last year, but I haven't played it yet.
Yeah, I have also only played this one. I thought it was pretty good. I was actually shocked at how good it was. I was very skeptical. People were like, oh, Lizard, you need to play this. You love tactics games. And I'm like, do I really? It's Mario plus Rabbids. But then I played it and I was like, you know what? You're right. It's pretty good.
Yeah, my friend, it's exactly the same. One of my friends was like, "Hey, Amy, you're gonna really like this game." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" No, I really recommend it. It's a really, really fun game. Definitely not a plot game, as you would probably guess based on the.
It is at least funny though. It's not like a good plot, but like you'll laugh.
Yeah, it's not a plot game, but it's it's enjoyable enough in the sense that it moves along. The cutscenes are pretty short and breezy and funny. So Dark Deity is interesting. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about it. I just finished it quite recently. I guess it's Kickstarter, kind of FE clone. Came out a couple of years ago. It feels like a mix of GBA Fire Emblem, but adds skills acquired from promotion and critical quotes and easy to access supports. Interesting game. Feels a little like Sacred Stones, but more of everything in both the good and bad. More skills, more branching promotions. Probably the thing I do not really like about Dark Deity very much is that I think it has too much. Instead of the weapon triangle, it has like this incredibly complex system of hitting weaknesses, and I honestly didn't really even remember all of it by the end of the game. I just kind of trusted that I guess what I'm doing is right or whatever. And so I think that the complexity, and it's like, I think the level of complexity it added to the weapon triangle, which ended up being like, I don't even know, they had 9 different types or something, like 5 different armor types and 4 different weapon types that all hit different types of weakness on each other. And I think it was just too much.
Yeah, I agree. For what it's worth, the developer also agrees.
Okay,
they announced Dark Deity 2 fairly recently, and they did a Reddit post where they talked about kind of takeaways from the first game. And that was one of the things they mentioned where they were like, the weaknesses and resistances were too much. So I expect to see that pretty heavily simplified in the sequel.
Which I really think is a good thing. I think it's a really, that was sort of a big, and I found like in practice, because of course in Fire Emblem, you can just remember, okay, well, the sword, lance, maybe even there's a second one with, the tomes or whatever. But fundamentally, it's pretty simple. Like, you can remember it relatively easily. And even like, I liked how in Fates they had two. They had like a red one and a blue one and a green one where, the color coding helps you remember the system. Whereas in Dark Deity, I just found it like, I'm too lazy to remember all this.
Yeah, it's a lot to remember.
It's an interesting game for sure. I obviously really, I just want to say that first of all, I really admire individuals who put together games like this, who go out and do the thing which many people dream about and don't finish. I have a great deal of admiration for that, but I think the game is a little bit. It has a lot of supports, and I really like the fact that you can unlock them really easily, so you get tons of supports, but I found them not very interesting. It's like, I felt like I could watch like 15 supports, and I played the game, I think, in April, and I already don't really remember.
Yeah, I didn't find too much of the cast terribly memorable. There's like a few exceptions. Benji is memorable, if only for his voice lines.
Oh, totally. It's like, I don't think that it's like devoid of character worth, but it was like, considering how much was dedicated to writing supports and having a lot of supports, I felt like I don't actually remember very much of it. It's kind of like, these were really good ideas to implement. The supports are really easy to access compared to like the GBA Fire Emblems. Accessing the supports is absolutely bonkers that you have to stand next to the characters for 34 turns or whatever.
Yeah. When I play Sacred Stones, I can very easily not unlock a support in the entire playthrough if I'm not trying to.
You have to really try. And so I found that that's something I really think that the series has improved on a lot in time, and Dark Deity brings that, but I just wish it had more compelling character work. I think the game's fun and it's worth playing if you like GBA Fire Emblem, but I definitely think it's. And I'm really glad to hear that the developer said that it was that he had recognized that was a problem, because it is. Or the complex weapon Nonagon or whatever.
Dark Deity is a game that I think for me may have suffered from me having unrealistic expectations for it, because I remember when it was announced. I think it was announced like there hadn't been a Fire Emblem in a minute, or certainly not one quite like that, because like I love Three Houses, but it's a very different Fire Emblem game than totally like the GBA era.
Totally,
So when I saw Dark Deity, I was like, oh, they're making this is Fire Emblem from when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And it feels that way at the beginning of the game. I actually think the game has a really strong start. Mm-hmm. Where I ran into problems with Dark Deity was the maps in the late game.
Bad.
They just left something to be desired. Which I will say, to be fair, I mean, it sounds like maybe this isn't that much of an improvement if you played it recently. I know they did a patch where they updated a lot of maps after I played it.
I did hear that some of the maps were worse before. I would say I just think it's too easy. Like I didn't play hard yet. I find it's like I don't really want to play hard and with a developer that I'm totally unfamiliar with. Like I did start my only engaged playthrough so far was the maddening, but because Dark Deity I didn't know anything about, I just played normal, and I felt like the second half, or especially like the last third of the game, is incredibly easy compared to I guess what I'm used to. So
it does. I don't want to be like overly negative on it. It does do some things well, I think. It does capture the GBA FE feel for me. Like when I'm playing it and like moving the units around, I'm like, yeah, this feels like GBA Fire Emblem.
And I hate the game for sure. Like, I think if it when it has a sequel, I will play the sequel. So it's not
Yes,
like
I'm gonna play Dark Deity 2 as well.
just just think that there's definitely some areas where I'm like, oh, this definitely could be better. And like, I think maybe with the last part of the game, I think that the skill system just kind of the um, the damage scale accelerates faster than the enemies are really able to cope with. I found I found a lot of it's like, oh, I just did 157 damage to an enemy with 90 HP or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And I will say, to the developers' credit, I thought that their Reddit post they did alongside the announcement was really good. Like, every issue I have with Dark Deity 1, they were like, yeah, we know this was a problem, and we're going to try to make that better in the second game. And I mean, obviously, we'll see when the sequel comes out, but the Reddit post made me very hopeful.
I think it's important. Like, I think in game development to recognize, and you notice that with Fire Emblem, even it's like over time even that thing I was complaining about the supports. It's like, okay, well, even Fire Emblem 9 Path of Radiance has kind of a less tedious support gathering system than the GBA games, and so they obviously recognize that's a problem. So I think I'm hopeful.
But then they did Fire Emblem 10 supports.
Yeah, never mind.
And then they were just gone. They weren't at 11 at all.
Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking there, but anyway.
But you're right. I mean, they're here and they're better now than they used to be.
I think it was we'll say a loopy progression up, but anyways, the last game I was going to talk about is Wild Arms XF, which is a very silly, just a little silly addition. Wild Arms is like a traditional like Japanese RPG series that's like kind of has a Wild Western theme. They made a strategy RPG called XF. It's kind of in between FFT with a job system. It does have an incredibly anime story with bombastic songs and, epic cutscenes, and has some puzzle-style battles, which if you're a fan of Wild Arms, you would know it's kind of a Wild Arms thing. The story is a little polarizing. Some people think it's really cheesy and overdramatic, but I like cheesy and overdramatic, so I was fine with it. The gameplay is pretty interesting, although I will say there's some pretty hard maps in there. It doesn't have difficulty modes, unfortunately. It's a cool game. It's interesting. It's also hex-based like Brigandine, and it's definitely interesting to see a traditional RPG developer try their hand at a strategy game. I think it's from '07. It's only on the PSP. My PSP actually it kicked the bucket about 5 years ago. So I haven't played XF since then, but I'm hoping someday they will release the 65% on Metacritic game that sold 25,000 copies on something.
When you posted about this on Twitter, it was insane to me. I was like, oh, is Amy reviewing regular RPGs now? And I was like, wait, there's a Wild Arms Tactics game?
Yeah, totally. There's also a Suikoden Tactics game, which I'm not even going to bother talking about because it's not that great. But I think there was a little bit of a stint where some of these traditional... and isn't there supposed to be a Persona Tactics coming out like soonish?
There is. I'm actually pretty excited about it.
So that's interesting. I've never played Persona 5, so I was actually thinking, it's like, I'm sitting here, I put it on my list of games to play. I know that it's like 100 hours long, but I'm thinking about it.
Oh, it's good. It is 100 hours long, but it's like the quickest 100 hours I've ever played.
Awesome.
Really fun game.
Anyways, I'm interested to see how that Persona Tactics turns out for sure.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. But that was all the games we had to talk about today. Thank you very much, Amy, for coming on and talking to me about these games that I haven't played.
It's a great pleasure. And I was going to say, it's nice to talk about this subject that I'm really fond of. So one thing I was going to mention before I go is I also, as I mentioned, I alluded to earlier in this conversation, I also participate in Fire Emblem fanzines. I've been in quite a few at this point, mostly Three Houses. I've also in One Fates one, and I'm also in the Triangle Strategy scene, which there's only one of. But the one I'm participating in right now is the Hubert fanzine, based on Hubert von Vestra from Three Houses. Don't ask me my opinion on Hubert, or else this video will take another hour. The pre-orders open September 1st. You can find it on Twitter or Tumblr. And it's a great project, full of love. If you happen to be a fan of scrunkly rat men.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend checking that out. I have looked at the Twitter page, and all of the artists and writers I've seen on there seem really awesome. So you'll find a link to that in the video description, and definitely recommend checking it out.
So thank you so much for having me, Lizard.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Sweet. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.